I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer for Gold Derby, and I'm joined today by Penelope Ann Miller to talk about Netflix's Dahmer Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. And Penelope, I know that hopping on the Ryan Murphy train was sort of a dream come true for you. So to start things off here, talk to me a little bit about what it was like to be on a Ryan Murphy set and what that experience was like getting to foray into his universe.
Yeah, I had been a fan for quite a while. I mean, probably starting with Glee,
Oh yeah.
um, and then the Versace, and it was just that blew me away. And I just thought, and then the first feud, I was like, okay, that's cool. It's period. I love doing period pieces.
Hmm.
So, but obviously he does really cool shows, and I thought it would be amazing to get the opportunity to be in one of them. So when this came along, it was definitely, yeah, a dream come true, and it worked out. And, supposedly a part of the family, the Ryan Murphy
Yeah.
family. So that's good. But yeah, it was actually an amazing set. I mean,
Hmm.
he hires so many talented people, from all the way from the actors to the crew to the makeup and hair to the wardrobe, the writers. It's a great set to be on, because everybody's at the top of their game.
Hmm.
And so I had a great time, actually, even though it's a very dark story, but I was very happy to go to work.
Yeah. And you know what? Because it's a dark story, it's even more important that the environment on set is sort of welcoming and
Yeah,
comforting.
for
And I
sure.
mean, I was just thinking about, because Ryan Murphy accepted the Carol Burnett Award at the Golden Globes earlier this year. And I was just thinking about how at least 50% of the people in that room have worked with him. And it's just
Yeah,
incredible to see how many opportunities he's created, for people above the line, below the line, and what
I
he's been
know.
able to do with this format, right?
Yeah, I mean, he really has given a lot of people more opportunities in terms of their careers, just
Hmm.
launching them and them becoming, and then of course bringing people back like Jessica Lange and things like that.
Exactly.
But he sort of mixes it up, which is nice. But yeah, he's been great for this community. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and now you're part of it. And on the show, you obviously play Joyce Dahmer, Jeffrey Dahmer's mother. And what I think is interesting about this show is that because it's not about her, you only get to see glimpses of her life. But by the end of the show, you still have such a clear understanding of who this woman is, of what her life has been, thanks to the writing and thanks to your performance.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, I'd be curious to hear from you, what your preparation process was like for this role. Was there a lot of material for you to sort of dive into, or did you mostly rely on what was on the page to really find your way into the character?
It was a combination. There
Mm.
wasn't a lot of material on Joyce, just because she wasn't, I mean, she was the mom. And of course, after the Jeffrey got caught,
Mhm.
everybody was interested in who is this monster's mother. And then there's always like, let's blame the mother, which she talked about in her interviews. Um, and obviously her ex-husband said a lot of things about her as well.
Mhm.
So there was his interview, there was a hard copy, there was sort of some hard copy interviews, and there were articles that she participated in interviews. So I was able to get a lot from that, actually, even though it was later in her life and we go back to when she was younger. We go
Mhm.
back and forth, but by the end I'm older. But the younger part was great too. But I
Yeah.
think it was very helpful to get that information from her and from the writing, but from her own words, because you kind of got the complexity of her somewhat denial, and then her
Mhm.
issues and her depression and her postpartum, and finding things out about herself. And so it's a complicated character, to be honest, because
Very.
um, she obviously had a very emotionally abusive marriage, and
Right.
was a lot of jealousy and issue, and even jealousy with the relationship that that Jeffrey had with his dad, which is, and then an affair, and then I leave. But that's one of my favorite scenes, is the scene when I leave, the scene with Evan Peters, that Jeffrey, when I leave with his brother. And I say, hurt people hurt people. And I think there was just that moment of seeing me getting so angry. And even though I didn't like them doing the roadkill, which I later blamed that for one of the reasons that maybe he started these murders. But he did it with his dad, and he never invited me. And that scene is sort of heartbreaking and sad and tragic and disturbing. And when I was doing the scene with Evan, I saw him, because he doesn't have hardly any emotion. He's so disconnected emotionally. But in that scene, when I'm yelling at him, he started to tear up. And that was just like this moment of like, oh, my son is upset. And it was just so hard to take, and I couldn't handle it. And get in the car and I'm, screaming at him, but I'm really angry at my husband, but I'm taking it out on my son. And then later, of course, finding out about these horrific murders. I think it's just hard to wrap your head around, being a mom of someone who could actually commit these tragic and horrific crimes. And so it was just, but then she talked about how she loved him, and she talked to him once a week in jail, and she'd visit him. So it wasn't like a completely estranged relationship, which is interesting. And she was saying what a good boy he was when he was a little boy, and how she just couldn't believe this could happen. And so it's just a lot of layers going on.
A ton of layers. And to sort of add to that, there are especially so many layers because there's also obviously a mental health struggle component to her character, to her story, because she suffered from depression, from postpartum psychosis, and so much more. And I'd be curious to hear from you as a performer, how did you ensure that you were depicting these struggles with as much nuance as possible and not painting them in broad strokes, which I think happens sometimes. So how did you avoid falling into that trap, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, I really didn't want to play this crazy caricature of this woman. And there was that fine line, even in the writing, because you see her screaming and talking about UFOs. And I mean, it's just, there's so many crazy things that are going on. And so I really was being very careful to play her as authentically as I possibly could, but as you said, bring out those nuances of those just little breaks in the complexity of who she was as a woman who was trying to get on with her life, to even help other people. I mean, later she was helping, she started a center for HIV patients. I think she wanted to give back in some way. And so and then she tried to commit suicide. She was so broken. And I think she talks about this in her interviews, that she was so traumatized and tormented. It's hard to live with that. And with her already having the depression. And so I just really wanted to hopefully be somewhat subtle in those in the performance, but also just bring out the reality that people do crazy things and act crazy. I mean, I know I do sometimes. And my husband can attest.
Everyone does. Everyone does.
My children. But that's life. And so I wanted to bring out the humanity. And I feel like this is the thing that I find brilliant about Ryan and Ian Brennan and the people who were a part of creating this, because they didn't want to glorify Jeffrey Dahmer. He's been glorified. He was the main guy that everybody knew about, the serial killer, and wanting to know about him. But what I found interesting to me and fascinating, and made me see the story in a whole new light and learn things that I had no idea about. I mean, I knew
Hmm.
Jeffrey Dahmer and sort of what he'd done and this and that, but that it was sensationalized, but there were human beings that
Exactly.
were involved in this other than Jeffrey, who had
Yeah.
lives, who had
Yeah.
livelihoods, who had families. I mean, these
Hmm.
victims were people who nobody knew about. They didn't talk
Yeah.
about the victims. And so in a sense, we all were part of that,
Exactly.
that world, including the parents and, the dad and the stepmom and myself and the victims and their families. And
Hmm.
so that to me was what I found so fascinating about the show. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, because you were one of the audience members, but I was too, because there was a
Hmm.
lot I was watching and hadn't
Of
seen, because
course.
I was sort of riveted,
Hmm.
um, because we were following those stories versus following just who Jeffrey was, even though that was also interesting because you found out who his family was.
Hmm.
And of course his performance is just
Extraordinary.
out of this world, extraordinary. He's extraordinary,
Yeah.
and he's such a sweetheart too. So it's just, it's hard because he's so nice, and then he's
Uh,
playing this
and and that
this
makes his performance even more terrifying.
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Especially because right before that, his role was, he did Mayor of Easttown not long ago, and to sort of see him go from that and then into this role, it's not like he hasn't played a lot of crazy roles throughout his career, but
Yeah,
he even talked about how his approach for this was a bit more grounded and how he wanted this sort of matter-of-fact storytelling approach, and I think that's why the performance is even more terrifying, and it should be, by the end of it, you should be in a way disgusted by
yeah,
Jeffrey on the show, obviously, and by that performance.
yeah,
And you really are. So,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, the whole point of also telling it is hopefully people are seeing that there was a systematic problem with
Exactly.
why he wasn't caught sooner.
Hmm.
And that to me is also just horrifying.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, he got away with it on so many occasions and they let him go. And you're
Yeah.
just thinking, what on earth? Uh, it's just hard to imagine. And I think also with Joyce, with my character,
Hmm.
there was the question of her wanting to study his brain
Yeah.
and donate it. That was another thing that I think, because she wondered, is there some biological uh issue
Explanation or,
explanation?
yeah.
Because it's really hard to fathom
Hmm.
what he actually did, and how could a human being with a conscience do something like this. And then of course there was the battle with my husband, and he had just wanted to cremate him and say
Hmm.
goodbye, because he said that's what Jeffrey wanted, but I said Jeffrey wanted to give back in some way, and to me that was my way of saying this is what Jeffrey wants to do to help,
Hmm.
so that it won't happen again. And maybe if we find
Absolutely.
out something, instead of just saying, oh well, it happened and he's gone and he's dead, you know.
Hmm.
So I think that was an interesting aspect too to the story.
Absolutely. And I want to get to that aspect in just a second. But
Yeah.
one of the aspects that I really found fascinating about Joyce's arc and about her storyline, and one of the areas where I think the nuance really stands out, is how much of a difference her environment makes. Because when she's in an environment, when she feels like she's being listened to or being heard by other people, you can
Hmm.
tell that she is much calmer, much more at ease. For example, at the counseling center. Um,
Yes.
Whereas when she's in an environment where she doesn't feel like she's being heard, like at home, you can tell she's like filled with all this rage and all this
Yeah.
agitation.
Yeah.
Um, don't you feel like the environment really makes all the difference in the world for her?
Yeah, I mean, I think truly for anyone, when they're not
Right.
being
Yeah.
listened to and they're not being heard and they're not being understood, and they're being written off or said, you're crazy, or you have a mental health problem, as if that's not something to have compassion for. You're
Exactly.
just you're medicated. And him also saying that was the reason, or he, was thinking that was the reason that Jeffrey got into this, which is a horrible thing to blame a mom for.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think the different environments, you're absolutely right. I mean, when she was in the counseling center and she was helping people and she was, feeling appreciated and
Exactly.
respected. And I think she was felt so much more confident. And I think at home she just felt completely ignored and completely um left out. I mean, it was almost like a child
Yeah.
who's basically left out of the group, and she just, because she was trying to connect with her husband and with Jeffrey, and she couldn't. And that's, I guess, ultimately why she left and then took her
Yeah.
the
No,
brother
but
with
yeah, but that's a very important point because I think one of the most poignant lines of the entire show is when she says, I think when she's called into the leadership's office or whatever, I think
yeah.
she says, she was listened to she was listened to for the first time in her life and realized that she wasn't crazy. I think
Right.
most people who suffer from anxiety can absolutely relate to this feeling of feeling completely alone, of feeling like you're alone with your struggles, and that just makes it so much worse. So the fact that she sort of feels like she's being heard for the first time just makes so much sense to anyone who's suffered
And
from
she was,
anxiety.
and the woman was giving her the job opportunity too, that
Yeah,
she had
yeah.
confidence in her, that she could actually help other people. And that made her
Hmm.
feel like she had a purpose in life. And I don't know, I think with Jeffrey too, there was, to grow up in an abusive, just hearing your parents fighting, them
Hmm.
leave, I essentially abandoned him. I mean, yes, he's 17, but still, you
Yeah.
think, so he was so disconnected, I think, from his family. I mean, he may have already just been predisposed to something that we have no idea because we didn't get to study his brain. But but I mean, there was definitely, he was very disconnected from humanity. And you can see
Absolutely.
that all throughout the performance. He just didn't know how to really connect, and there was that awkwardness. But I saw that in that scene, that one scene, that breaking point when my character, the mom, leaves him. It's just sort of
Hmm.
like, oh, now I'm alone. And really,
Yeah,
that's when the murder started to happen. So there is something about that to me that I found pretty interesting in terms of like trying to put the puzzle pieces
hmm,
together, although I don't think we'll ever really know for sure.
no,
Um, but yeah, just seeing her, like you said, the rage and the frustration, and she's taking it out on him, this little kid,
exactly.
this young boy. It's crazy, but people do that. They just blame other people. They don't know how to, and especially in that time, they weren't dealing with a lot with, I mean, when she's hearing for
Mental
the first
health.
time, oh, I have mental health.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And now we're sort of going into the area of blame, which I think is something very important to talk about when it comes to Joyce's arc, because, talking about the blame she sort of carries around with her because she does admit, some blame in her suicide note. She says, I cannot deny that I didn't have, or that I can't deny that I had a part in this, she basically says. But then
Yeah.
after that, after she survives the suicide attempt, like you said, she's the one who wants Jeffrey's brain to be inspected. Whereas Lionel, her ex-husband, obviously, is the one who says, it's time to put this all behind us. It's time to
Mhm.
move on. So
Right.
do you think Joyce was eventually able to move on in the same way that Lionel was in the story? Or do you think she was chasing after answers all the way up until her death in 2000?
Well, I do think she carried a lot of guilt. She talks about it.
Mm,
I think it's hard not to feel somewhat responsible. That's what's just so heartbreaking to me. Um, but I think, yeah, I think that this is why she was trying to help people with HIV, with mental health, with issues like that, and wanting to study the brain, because I think she, as I said before, she was tormented by
mhm.
this, by finding out about what her son had done. And I don't think she could put it to rest. I don't think she could put it behind her. I mean, Lionel wrote a book, I think she talked about writing a book,
Yeah.
um, but to hear her side of the story, um, but it's just, I do feel that that's why she's on top of her already suffering from depression and postpartum depression, just mental health issues, just all the way through her life. I think this on top of it certainly added on. And I think, I don't think, I mean, and you can see, and we did this, and this was another thing that I just thought was amazing, was the costume, the wardrobe, the makeup, the
Yeah.
hair, everything played a part in the portrayal. And for me, it helped me so much because we talked about Rudy Mance, who did the wardrobe, who was brilliant, and Shay Sanford and Gigi Williams. And we talked about like her kind of, and you see it too in photographs, this sort of haggard, she becomes quite sort of haggard by the end, and smoking. And she was sort of falling apart and trying to keep it together. And to me, another scene too that was just so heartbreaking was the scene during the trial when she goes to one of the victims' families' homes.
Oh my God, yeah.
And was trying to talk to the mom. She ended up speaking to the grandmother. But I mean, imagine that. And she did this. Imagine that. She went to ask for help for her son to get mental help, like that he needed mental help. And they're looking at like,
what are you asking me here?
What, how you like, seriously? I mean, you want me to help your son when ours is dead and been murdered in the most horrifying way? I mean, to me is just, wow. Like there scenes like that were just, like you said, it's not like I was throughout the film or the show, but in those moments, like those scenes, like to me just were everything for me just to play.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of those scenes, they added just so much context to the story, and it just sort of enriched the story. And what I really like when, sometimes characters aren't necessarily the lead and only have so much screen time. I think every scene that we get, every minute of screen time that we get from them is even more meaningful because we don't get to see a lot of them. And I feel like with Joyce, that is absolutely the case, where with each scene, we're seeing new layers of this character and more development. And we get to see, how she sort of evolves after he dies and everything. And that's why I think it's such a fascinating character arc to sort of witness. Thank you. Yeah, of course. And I would love to talk about this arc forever, but we're unfortunately out of time.
Oh, yeah, it was fun. Yeah,
it was a lot of, thank you so much, Penelope, for your time today, for taking the time to speak to us. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you, and very proud to be part of a show that I think on all levels was really outstanding. And so I was honored to be included in it. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me and talk about Joyce.
Yeah.
So
of course.
Mama Dahmer.